This stark landscape, baked by centuries of sun, is made up of over 25,000 square kilometers of sand, gravel and rock sprinkled with salt. Rainfall here is rare, and even then it falls in torrents that wash the earth away. This is the Dasht-e Kavir, a vast and hostile desert in Iran. The men whose livelihood depended on crossing this desert built caravanserais to refresh themselves and their camels. When the old trade routes dried up, the buildings fell into ruins, and the desert, scarred by overgrazing, once more became the arid waste where only lizards seemed able to survive. But in addition to lizards, there's a whole group of unique animals here capable of living without drinking water. It's this group which now needs human protection if it's to prosper in the Great Salt Desert. The Salt Desert is in central Iran, separating great mercantile cities like Isfahan and Shiraz in the west from Herat on the road to Samarkand in the east, hence its importance as a trade route. Once, millions of years ago, this was the bed of a shallow sea, but the earth shifted and it was raised to dry out and become a sterile plain impregnated with salt. Centuries of rains have washed the salt out of some parts of the desert, only to collect and concentrate it in other areas which are completely devoid of life. There is evidence that life did exist here. Fossils of sand dollars which once crawled over the bed of some ancient lagoon are embedded in the rocks. In the heat of the day, lizards and their prey are about the only things that move, and even they can't stay for too long in the sun. The food chain here is simply illustrated. The beetle eats the plants, which can store a little moisture from the occasional rains, and the lizard eats the beetle. Some of the lizards thrive here. The desert monitor can reach 1.5 meters long. Its stilt-legged walk keeps its belly off the hot ground. In the dry heat of the desert, reptiles flourish. The deadly horned viper, a distant cousin of the rattlesnake, can move quickly by sidewinding. The horned viper is 1/2 meter long and highly venomous. Like the lizards, it has to conserve its meager water supply by keeping in the shade as much as possible. The hiss of ridged scales rubbing together is the distinctive sound of the most venomous of the desert snakes, the saw-scaled viper. To the traders who did their business between the great cities, the desert was an inconvenience to be overcome. In around 1650, they built a stone aqueduct over 11 kilometers long to carry water from the Shiaku, the Black Mountains, to the nearest flat site where their camels could graze. Now the aqueduct stands as a memorial to men whose determination reduced the great desert to a minor obstacle to trade. At the end of the aqueduct lies the great Abbasabad caravanserai. The building serves another purpose now. It's the local headquarters of the Department of the Environment. It seems appropriate that a monument to the past should also serve as home to a service dedicated to the future. Its previous function, after the camels had gone, was as a target for gunnery practice, but it was so well built that it withstood even that. Not all the caravanserais have survived intact. In a remote corner of the desert lay the ruins of the long-lost Fort Laqab, and Until the turn of this century, it was the headquarters of a band of robbers. But when they left, the fort was forgotten. Recently, it was accidentally rediscovered during an aerial reconnaissance. Now the ruined walls lie open to the sun, but the spring still flows. The spring at La Cabe sinks into the sand after a few hundred meters. In some years, its water allows a weak growth of vegetation. At the old Sarai of Ain al-Rashid, the vegetation grows thickly beside the spring, but the water is the faintest trickle now. The spring failed soon after the building was completed in the mid-17th century. The site was abandoned at once, and the unfortunate architect was beheaded. For the last 300 years, the tumbling walls have been no more than an artificial rock outcrop on the plain. But though the place looks deserted, it's not uninhabited. Like a natural outcrop, the walls provide a home for one of the desert birds, the kestrel. The kestrel's peaceful retreat is disturbed from time to time by earthquakes, which bring down more of the abandoned masonry each year. Under the ancient arches, potter wasps make their nests. The potter wasp is perhaps one of the most industrious of all the desert's inhabitants, making a living from the most unpromising of surroundings. The female collects dried clay from the desert floor, mixing it with sticky saliva to make a thick paste. The water in the saliva is precious in this arid place, so the building material is used with great economy. She molds a ball of clay into a thin sheet to make the wall of the nest, just thick enough not to collapse as it dries. Each trip for new supplies of clay uses up more of her precious water supply, but she works fast to finish her task within an hour. The wasp gets her water from her food. She eats pollen and extracts the water from it molecule by molecule as she digests it. This ability to live on metabolic water, as it's known, is the secret of survival for many of the desert animals. Barely an hour later, the wasp is putting the rim on the pot, the last stage in building. She'll now lay an egg inside. The potter wasp collects caterpillars from plants growing round the oasis, but the caterpillars aren't easy to find. Each one may take up to 2 hours to locate, and the nest, when it's closed, will contain 5 or 6 of them to feed the growing wasp grub when it hatches. She stings each caterpillar as she collects it, to paralyze it. After long hours of continuous hunting, the job is done, and the wasp can seal the pot, filling its mouth with more clay built into the rim she left before. The nests of the desert potter wasp are built together in clumps to conserve building materials, by letting most of the pots share a wall with their neighbours and to protect the inner ones from excessive heat. Much the same design was used by the desert dwellers, the people who served or robbed the camel caravans on the old trade routes. Their villages were built of clay, the houses side by side in much the same way as the potter wasp's clumps. Now the villages are deserted because the caravans are no more. At the old waterholes, the odd lone camel appears, a remnant of the convoys of ships of the desert. Hundreds of feral camels were removed from the desert when it became a national park, and the increased grazing benefited another wild mammal. As the vegetation grew up, it provided a source of food for the onager, the wild ass of Iran. In the 1970s, onagers could still be seen in the park, but now they're confined to a region in the south of Iran. Although they can go without food and drink for days on end, they must eventually find a supply of desert vegetation. But the thousands of camels in the salt desert in the heyday of the trade routes ate almost all that was available and left little for the asses. The establishment of a few modern roads has meant that the desert is no longer crisscrossed with camel trails, nor overgrazed by the beasts which trod them. It's recovered its own rhythm of drought and brief times of plenty. Rainwater, when it comes, will arrive with spectacular force. A desert is defined as an area which receives less than 25 centimeters of rainfall a year. But in most deserts, when rain does come, several years' supply often arrives in one torrential delivery. In the light of the desert storm, the earth swiftly absorbs the water, but a lot of it goes to waste. The baked ground can soak up only a small part of the deluge, and the rest of it rushes away to be lost in the salty sand. But it's not all lost. Immediately after the storm, plants which may have been waiting 3 years for water suddenly grow and reproduce. As they do so, they start a chain reaction all over the desert. One plant in particular, called zygophyllum, is an indicator of how much rain the desert has had in the past seasons. Its thick leaves grow more plentifully after a rainstorm, and they're the staple diet of several different animals. So if the rains are poor, the leaves will be sparse, and the animals' numbers will decrease. The other plants all draw water from the soil and incorporate it into their growing leaves. Most of the desert's insects time their hatching to be among the first to benefit. The insects themselves represent a step on the route the water follows to higher animals, predatory birds, for example. So they must adopt camouflage or warning colors to protect themselves. A gaudy caterpillar has evolved its colors to warn off predators. A furry one will discourage an inquisitive bird with a chemical from the spines on its back, which causes irritation. Among the plants which take the opportunity of spreading during the wet period is a sedge, which screws its seeds into the ground. The seeds are dispersed by the wind, and when they settle, they revolve under wind power to bore their way into the sticky soil. The The result is clumps of sedge growing in the most marginal of sites. As they consolidate the sand, they provide a home for the desert's most unexpected inhabitants. The jerboa burrows in the sand, emerging only at night or in the very early morning. The jerboa is a seed-eater, harvesting the products of the short flowering period. The white tip to its long tail serves to confuse the aim of nocturnal predatory birds like owls, and the hairy pads on its feet give it a better grip on the sand. The jerd is a close relation. None of these desert rodents need to drink water. Like the potter wasp, they can get all they need from digesting their food. The delicate little five-toed jerboa also has a tail designed to distract any attacking owl. As the sun rises, lizards become active. It's not only the heat the jerboa has to escape. The sun has warmed the monitor lizard into activity, and it's the next link in the food chain. The monitor is also food for larger birds of prey, but for the moment it's still the predator. Another link in the food chain is represented by the jabiru gazelle, but its predators, leopards and cheetahs, are scarce and perhaps now extinct in this great desert. Even the gazelle's droppings are important in the life of the hunting wasp. The female wasp excavates a burrow in the dry earth and then uses a gazelle pellet to hide the entrance. When the pellet is securely in place, the wasp goes off on a long journey on foot. It has several tasks to complete before it returns. The first is to find a meal of pollen from a desert flower. Secondly, it needs to mate with one of the wandering males on the desert floor. Then it needs to find the buried caterpillar of a specific kind of moth. When it's detected a caterpillar using its sensitive antennae, the wasp digs it up and takes it back to its burrow. Since the caterpillar is about 5 times as big as the wasp, and the wasp's burrow may be several hundred meters away, it's a long haul. On returning, the wasp uncovers its hole, ready to take the caterpillar inside as food for the grub which will soon hatch. The solifugid, or sun spider, has the most powerful jaws for its size in the animal kingdom. Solifugids seem to be highly territorial. They spend a lot of time fighting their neighbors. The losers will be killed and eaten. Solifugids aren't venomous. they normally eat the beetles that feed on the plants which grow when the rain falls. Their particular food chain continues beyond them to the long-eared hedgehog, which ignores their powerful jaws and moves in quickly when it stumbles across the scene of a dispute. This delicate food web of the desert survived for thousands of years until man upset it with grazing animals and trade routes. A wind pump on the site of an ancient well represents a small attempt to reverse the process. This trickle of brackish water won't irrigate the entire desert, but it does create a small oasis. Mosquitoes and dragonflies may not be the most typical desert animals, but they are surprisingly common in old springs like Ain al-Rashid. Visiting migrant waders from the far north find the oasis as welcome as the old camel caravans. They share the mosquito larvae with resident frogs. The little trickle of water doesn't affect the desert as a whole, but it increases the variety of the creatures that are able to live there. Noisy flocks of sandgrouse spend the early part of the day near the oasis, along with horned larks, which feed on the seeds of grasses. For the resident birds, the little waterhole does improve the desert. They're able to travel to get to it during times when their more traditional feeding and drinking places are blighted by drought. All over the apparently barren plain that forms the Great Salt Desert, life is teeming and stirring, from solifugids and monitors to jerboas and jerds. The spiny-tailed lizard is the only vegetarian lizard in the world, and one of the most heavily armored. Travelers to Samarkand no longer have to risk their lives across the Great Salt Desert. They can fly or drive on a modern road. The old challenge of the Dashti Kavir has faded, but there's a new one in its place. It is to protect and preserve the desert, its history, and its remarkable wildlife as a source of wonder and inspiration to future generations.